Good morning, everyone. Just reflecting on Secretary Granholm's remarks. She just laid out a really exciting vision for a future, right, where billions of federal dollars will flow into technology innovation, research, investment, and frontline communities to address climate change. But there's a real chance, more likely than not, that most of that money will do little to address the real impacts of climate change or the causes. And that's because we have a real bias when it comes to climate science and technology. Here you see an image from 2 weeks ago in Lokoja, Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the countries where I carry out research. Severe flooding from rainfall, which experts say is driven by the climate crisis, led to emergency releases from dams in both Nigeria and Cameroon, and catastrophic flooding that killed over 600, displaced 1 million, destroyed farmland, refugee settlements, and has left devastation in its wake, similar to the recent catastrophic flooding from torrential monsoons in Pakistan. Similarly, more than almost 2,000 killed, tens of millions displaced, and just devastation in its wake. The irony of this impacting countries like Nigeria and Pakistan are that they've only contributed 1% of global emissions that's driving global warming and the crisis that we're currently in. And yet they're ground zero. They're on the front lines as countries, and then of course the most vulnerable in those countries. This begs the question of climate justice and even calls for climate reparations. Climate justice shifts the conversation about climate change from greenhouse gas emissions and end-of-pipe solutions like spraying sulfur in the atmosphere to civil rights and human rights of those most impacted who are experiencing the first and worst impacts of climate change. And the same inequalities, the same global inequalities that we see playing out in terms of impacts also drive research into climate change. A study was done last year where scientists use machine learning to review 100,000 climate studies and found something. They were trying to estimate the human impacts of climate change, how many people are already experiencing the effects, but they found something even more surprising, that 2-to-1 climate studies are mostly done in Europe and North America compared to places in Africa or island nations that are losing their territory to sea level rise. So there's a hole in our understanding about the impacts of climate change. Similarly, this inequality even affects our sensors like satellites. So the very sensors that read the sun's reflection from the Earth's surface and tell us what the temperature is, where we get our readings and estimates of average global warming, they rely on algorithms that have to be ground truthed by validation stations on the ground. Well, there's an inequality in where those stations are located. The vast majority are near universities that have the funding in the global north. There are only a handful in the entire continent of Africa, and yet Africa has vastly different patterns of rainfall and weather than in the global north. So even our understanding what scientists are starting to talk about in terms of that disparity is that we're underestimating how much global warming is actually occurring. The planet is hotter than we think it is, and we're experiencing more impacts than we think we are. So that's part of what I want to talk about when it comes to the title of this talk, There Is No Way. And I reflect on this when I think about what motivated me to get into international humanitarian relief and development in the first place, and what drives my research on poverty reduction and environmental justice as an academic. This is a reflection of public housing projects I was born in Newark, New Jersey, Hayes Homes. And Newark, almost the entire city of Newark was redlined by the Federal Housing Administration. And redlining is a practice many of you probably have heard of that led to disinvestment in inner cities all across the country, and that restricted the residential movement of Black families and facilitated white flight. And you can actually see this federal practice when you go down the halls of my elementary school, Cleveland Elementary. You see the class, the changing faces of children in the class pictures for each class over the years. Well, the consequences of that were devastating in the sense that most of Newark is a frontline polluted dumping ground for the global economy based on consumerism. There is no way. Similarly, right here in the Bay Area, port communities like West Oakland, where thousands of trucks emitting diesel and particulates and black soot come in and out of the neighborhood every single day along the freeways and through the streets, connecting with warehouses in the neighborhood that act as magnet sources for these mobile sources of pollution, and connect to ports that are bringing goods to and from the global economy, are leading to disproportionate rates of cancer and asthma, and actually an 11-year discrepancy in life expectancy between residents of the flats nearest to the port and those who are more relatively affluent in the hills of Oakland. So we need to talk about systems change, not just climate change. We live in the era of the Anthropocene, where human impacts on the planet are causing global level change on an increasingly urbanized planet. Here I have an illustration of from California's fourth climate assessment, from a business as usual scenario, from looking at conversion. You can see the red and the black of conversion from urban and agricultural land spreading over the green. And this kind of reflects what you saw in the first study published in Science in 1997, where a group of scientists laid out the systems model of human domination of Earth's ecosystems, and how population size and resource use, were causing changes in Earth's biogeochemistry, leading to biodiversity loss as well as climate change. And what all of these, these models and diagrams, they're helpful in understanding the drivers of climate change. They're even sophisticated, but they leave out a lot. They leave out the inequality among people that's driving exploitation of land, labor, and resources that are the true drivers of climate change. And we have to talk about, as much as we're talking about mitigation, and we're excited about the potential of addressing emissions, we have to talk about adaptation, because the fifth Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that there are already some consequences of the climate crisis that we cannot come back from. Whether it's the melting of the ice sheet of Greenland, warming oceans, sea level rise, these impacts that we're feeling are going to continue to be felt. We're trying to slow them down now. We can't stop them. So we have to talk about adaptation at the same time as we talk about mitigation. And to do that, we're going to need the voices of frontline communities to address both. And as we're going to see, there's a connection between mitigation and adaptation. Last summer, a colleague and I and our students, she's in public health, we did a study looking across the country regionally the connections between climate disasters and social vulnerability by region in the United States. And what we found is that racialized disparities and other disparities associated with extreme climate hazards can be traced to inequalities in funding, in policies, and practices. And so frontline voices are going to be critical in addressing both the causes and consequences of climate change. This is an image from work in Columbus, Ohio, mental maps of residents. So this was a project for urban retrofit, green adaptation, but a community-driven redevelopment project for urban retrofit in Columbus, Ohio. And what we're seeking to do is to do redevelopment and green infrastructure investments and bring urban agriculture and food security and things that would both address climate change but benefit residents of community in a way that wouldn't displace them and cause what many scholars and activists are calling green gentrification. And so we started with hand-drawn maps of residents, mental models of their neighborhoods, turn these individual mental models into social maps and then into spatial data sets and geographic information systems where we could overlay them with other forms of data and actually actually transform redevelopment in the neighborhood in a way that reduced displacement. Similarly, Aclima, working with residents and leaders like Ms. Margaret Gordon and who created the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, ground truth their mobile and stationary sensors with residents, with bucket brigades measuring air quality block by block, which is revolutionizing our understanding of air quality and revealing the connections between black carbon, soot, methane, short-lived climate pollutants that are actually 45% of emissions and are actually an easy-to-target solution to our climate crisis. Methane has a huge global warming potential, much more than CO2, but it's also connected to the formation of ground-level ozone that's causing respiratory deaths a million respiratory deaths around the world. So by addressing local pollution, we're also addressing the global climate crisis. In my last few slides, I just want to talk about the potential of other forms of hyperlocal data. This is San Francisco's 311 hotline data. Here you can see hotspots of sewage backup and flooding and pipe breaks. And this is a useful data set. What if we could do more with this, like have real-time resident experience of neighborhood and combine that with data on rising groundwaters that are disrupting wastewater infrastructure that runs beneath our streets. We're creating digital twin models. This is one of Shanghai that are combining sensor GIS data into real-time 3D visual models. These are amazing new innovations. Most of them are being used for closed systems like airports or single systems like transportation systems. What if we could bring lived experience and hyperlocal data into these kinds of innovations? What if we could combine experiential knowledge of frontline communities, cultural and spiritual knowledge of indigenous and traditional communities, and combine it with mainstream knowledge and really address the climate crisis, both the drivers and its impacts. If this is something that interests you and motivates you and inspires you, I would love to connect. Thank you so much.